So, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to this extraordinary panel, which happens to be the last panel of the day, and I'm sure you all have been totally attentive to all the discussions that have taken place in the course of today. I recognize some of you from this morning's session, but there are many more than this morning. It shows that it may have been difficult to get up this morning, but with enough good Indonesian coffee, everybody's in the room, so thank you. And this afternoon, we will discuss with the eminent members of this panel their respective region or country's interest in trade and in a strengthened system, areas where they think that trade reforms could make the biggest difference to the global economy, and maybe explore some practical ways as to how the system can be reformed to be more efficient and to continue to deliver benefits. I will introduce the panel members, although they need no introduction, but nonetheless. To my left, Pierre Moscovici, who is the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Taxation and Customs. You're a Vice President of the Commission as well? Well, he could. Roberto Azevedo, who is the Director General of the WTO, who spoke eloquently this morning about the necessity to reinvent and generate new ideas, which I'm sure you've been playing with the whole day. Ernesto Zedillo, who is former President of Mexico and who is currently the Director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. And finally, Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen, I hope I can call you Ulrik, thank you, who is currently the Permanent Secretary of State of Denmark's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but he will also assume shortly the role of Deputy Secretary General to the OECD in early 2019. I'm going to ask you questions in your current capacity. If you feel that you have to step out of that particular capacity, you just have to say, I'm putting my other hat on.
Used to that.
That's good, that's very good. So I'm going to actually ask a few first questions, and for the time that is left to us, and I don't have the clock in front of me, so I have no idea about time, which is very comfortable. Can you see it?
Right there.
Oh yes, it's in the plants, so I couldn't see it. Then the floor will be yours, and you'll be able to ask a few questions from the panel members. So I'm going to start by just acknowledging that over the last few decades where we have been involved in policy making, certainly the trade system and the trade rules have been more open, more transparent, hopefully more efficient as well. And I would like to start with you, Ernesto, if I may, because you've been studying and you've been practicing this, and Mexico is clearly a country which has had the benefit of trade. Can you just identify for us the benefits of trade, what it has meant, and whether it is legitimate at the moment to just argue against trade?
Well, let me start by mentioning that not too long ago, the Mexican economy was extremely close. Mexico was a paradigm in Latin America and in the world of the lost decade of the 1980s. Our economy was a mess on the fiscal front, but also because for many other reasons, including the inefficiencies stemming from being a closed economy, our economy not only was stagnant or low growth, but the Mexican economy was shrinking. There was a moment in which, fortunately, there was the opportunity to make a big push for reform.
That's when you were elected?
No, before my time. It was really in the late second half of the 80s. President Miguel de la Madrid was responsible for that. We started this process of reform, and at some point we decided that as part of that reform, we needed to open up. There was a lot of opposition because there were a lot of vested interests. We started to open, well, first we joined the GATT, which was incredible. Mexico was not part of the GATT as late as 1986. We started to open up, and then we say, why not talk to the US about NAFTA? And we got NAFTA in the early 90s, negotiated NAFTA. It has been around now for some years. Unfortunately, now we have NAFTA minus. Not that bad, and I can talk about that later in the session, but it's evident that thanks to NAFTA, significant regions and sectors of the Mexican economy have moved forward immensely. We still have the problem of duality, which means that we have a modern sector of the economy and a very traditional sector of the economy that has not been part of that modernization drive. Some people like to point that as a failure of NAFTA, but that's a terrible mistake. The fact that we still have significant pockets, regional and population pockets, that are not part of that modern economy has nothing to do with NAFTA. It's about domestic policy. We haven't done what is needed to incorporate those regions and sectors into the opportunities provided by NAFTA. So I think Mexico is really a paradigm of what you can achieve once you decide that you can open up, and you can open up to the most powerful economy in the world. And actually, if you do that, then you can do anything else. And we did it, and it's not been the tragedy that many people fear for many reasons, among other personal or corporate interests. And I think it has been a great opportunity for the three partners.
Ulrich, your economy, Denmark, is a very open economy, if only by virtue of its size and, in a way, limited resources. Tell us what the impact of trade has been in terms of development in your country and in the region, because between the Nordic countries there is massive exchange as well. And we'll come to Europe with you, Pierre, if I may.
Right, but ours is a completely or entirely different story than the Mexican. We have, so to speak, been married to trade from the very beginning. The Vikings were known for killing and stealing and raping. It's less known that 99% of the time they were actually trading. We do it in a slightly less aggressive way today, but it's not a matter of choice for us, really. We have no, as you said, no natural resources except for wind. We have no heavy industries. We only rely on two things, really, that we can adapt technology a little bit better than the rest of the competition, and that we can then sell it on the international market. So for us, it's not a choice, it's a necessity. We have to be agile. We have to embrace both new technology and the globalization, especially in terms of free trade. So we basically owe our prosperity to free trade, multilateralism, and the institutions represented on this stage.
And without trade, Denmark would be nowhere.
That's for sure.
Back to the Viking days.
We would be, yeah. You should keep us afloat so we don't revert to that.
And that applies also to other countries who are your neighbors and who, for some, have huge natural resources. I'm thinking of Norway, for instance, but with which you trade enormously.
It does, and I would say that we have, even though Norway has a lot of huge resources, we share perhaps destiny with Norway, Sweden, Finland, Netherlands, and a few others, and I would say that it goes for us as a group that perhaps no other countries in the world have more at stake right now than we have. We're small. That means we're more reliant on international rules and norms than anyone else. We are open. That also means that we have more at stake in the open economy and the WTO. And we are also countries that are basically, as countries formed on human rights, democracy, reliance on open markets and so on, the very premises also of the international trading system. So I would argue that I could think of perhaps 5 other countries with more at stake than Denmark in what we see around us now with a crumbling international order, not only in the international arena of trade, but that is perhaps where it would hurt our prosperity the most.
Right.
This goes for all countries, but it goes especially for small open economies.
And certainly you belong to another larger union, which has a lot to do with the movement of products and services without restrictions, which is the European Union. So Pierre, what role is trade playing, has played, both within the union and as a major partner in the trade negotiations at WTO level?
That's, I think, a quite simple question to answer, because I would say the even existence of EU is about lifting barriers.
Yeah.
It's about creating a single market. It was first called a common market, which means that there is freedom of movement as well for services, for goods, for capital, and of course for people. When you move in Europe, you have no more customs control between our member states, and we have grown so interdependent that 70% of our trade, or foreign trade, is inside the EU. So I would say that, of course, EU is much more than a market. It's also a political construction. It has to be integrated. We have developed other tools. Denmark is not part of the Eurozone, but I think the Euro is probably one of the greatest achievements we've added to the market. But well, we are the living example of countries who historically have fought each other, have been divided, and that have been united by a market, which is, in a way, a political construction as such. And so this is why we are in favor of free trade, not any free trade. We need controls, we can have improvements of the negotiations, we can improve even the institutions. But I saw, Christine, that you asked for a de-escalation. Trade wars are stupid. Trade wars are not something easy to win. Trade wars are very difficult to fight, and they impoverish everybody. They are a major risk to the world growth, and this is why we cannot accept that protectionism is an issue. We must stick to the multilateral order. Of course, we need to fix it. We need to have it moving in a better way, and I know that Roberto is certainly ready for that. But WTO is the legitimate place where we must solve our disputes and where we must improve our trade framework. And so this is clearly the position of the EU. We've made proposal for reform of WTO. We'll have the occasion to discuss that, but certainly we are about market economy, we're about freedom, we're about open society. Open society and open economies, as you said, Ulrike, move along together. And we must not give food for populists with protectionism.
They're called the Denmark principles, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before I play the devil's advocate, because I want to go a little bit deeper on that, Roberto, as we listened very carefully to Angel and to you this morning, it is clear that trade for a period of time has grown faster than global growth. Then it moved down a bit. It was about 1.5 relative to 1 of growth, then down to 1 equal. Then at the time of the financial crisis, it went even a little bit further down, and now it's picking up. So gradual slowing process of trade relative to growth. By the same token, when you look at the various negotiation rounds, there has also been a slowing path of negotiations towards conclusion up until now, where we've all tried to negotiate really hard with no result. Do you think there is a correlation between sort of a bit of a slowing tendency for trade and the slowing pace at which negotiations were taking place, or is that totally uncorrelated?
No, I'm sure there will be some correlation, particularly with the effect of the negotiations. But there are other factors that also played an important role there. So people usually compared when we had the 2008 crisis and the leveraged of trade, you know, the multiplier effect. So if the global economy would grow by 1, trade would grow by 2, right?
That was
so there was a
crisis.
2 to 1, yeah. But that, I think, was very much leveraged by the boom of the emerging economies in the early 2000s. So China made a big difference. So China was growing so fast, and the trade from the emerging economies was picking up. There was a boom of commodities. Those economies were growing really fast, and the trade was much more leverage than before. The average is actually, the historical average is actually around 1.5. So when we had the financial crisis, that number began to go down, down, down. It actually went below 1.
Below 1, yep.
It went below 1. Now it's picking up. And clearly, I think it's picking up because the economy was growing more in a more robust fashion. In fact, which is something that is annoying, is the fact that it was doing so well until we began to have these trade tensions and these trade restrictive measures put in place, and we're beginning to revise the numbers down. So, for example, trade expansion, we were expecting this year, our first estimate was around 4.4%. We already revised it down to 3.9. Next year it was going to be 4. Now we revised it down to 3.7. And some people, I hear it sometimes, people saying, well, but all these things are happening, but the economy is still good. Of course it's still good because the impact is not there yet.
Yeah.
There is a delay between the moment when you introduce these measures and when they're actually affecting the economy. And I think we may see more of that kind of impact in the future if we don't do anything about it.
Let me play another devil's advocate a bit, and I know that some of you are going to react. Everything that you say is nice and fine, and it's been a huge contributor to the economy, and it's key to the development of your economy, but it has not been good for all people. And because of the supply chain organization, because of the link between FDIs and trade, because of the massive restructuring that have taken place, because of the labor cost advantage that is granted by those other countries, a lot of people are suffering. And trade is inflicting serious wounds to many countries, in particular in the advanced economies. Hence, the populist movement, let's call it that way, which has been growing in many corners of the advanced economies in particular.
I will oppose what you are saying.
Okay.
Radically.
Go ahead.
Fundamentally. Because I think this is the story that we have been told over and over again for the last few years, not only by politicians of various persuasions, but sadly by some members of my own profession who have made a career repeating that without...
You're talking about the economists here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
Nobody's perfect. I apologize. Right, not lawyers. You have other sins, not that one. Okay? But I would argue very strongly against that argument. What has happened is that when things go well, we tend to hype trade as if it were a silver bullet to solve everything in the world. And we go very quiet about domestic policies that we should undertake if we dislike some ills that exist in society. Now, when things go wrong and we have a financial crisis or anything like that, immediately the reaction is to say, you see, all these ills are happening because of trade, right? And that is very dangerous on two accounts, of course, because this is wrong analysis, and second, because it leads to very wrong policy prescriptions and to a fundamental evasion of responsibility. I think most of the things that we dislike, and I dislike poverty, I dislike poor income distribution, I dislike inequities, I dislike the fact that in the US the median wage was stagnant for half a century. Well, all of that has very little to do with trade, and is actually the consequence of a political choice taken by that society and that political system. You know, they have done a lot of things, tax reforms, highly redistributive policies. They fight every day because they hate universal health coverage. They have a highly segmented educational system. They have an educational system for people like us, for the elite, but very poor educational system for the rest of the population. And we could make the list of factors that have influence on the conditions, and I'm just talking about the US, that we
I think
dislike.
we all understand.
And then suddenly says, all of this has to do with trade, or even with technology, which is even terrible. This is going back to the 17th century. Let's reject the scientific revolution. Let's reject the Enlightenment, and nobody wants to look himself or herself in the mirror. So in the past, we have taken very explicit political choices to make our societies unequal, to have poor people, and to leave people on the fringes, abandoned by the modern trends in the economy.
So in essence, Ernesto, what you're saying is stop blaming trade for all the ills and evils.
Blame whatever little blame, and we economists have known that since 1937, when Stolper Samuelson wrote his famous article, trade does have income distribution consequences. And we economists know that you have to do some compensation. But that's a very minor part of the ills that we dislike happening in the world. And I think it's a terrible political mistake that many people, including the IMF, sort of have gone into the defensive, and you produce these extraordinary papers, which I love and read and assign to my students, but the bottom line is that there is a sort of guilty complex. Instead of saying, we need to think hard of what needs to be done to improve those things that we don't like. I gave you my example before, when we had to, or we wanted to fix the extreme poverty problem in Mexico, rather than say, how do I close the border to make those people's condition better? No, you have a problem, which is poverty, extreme poverty in rural sector, so you design an instrument exactly to attack that problem.
Yeah, Ernesto.
Poor income distribution, you redistribute income by taxing through the rich and giving in an intelligent way to the poorer people.
I would argue, though, because you tempted me to argue, that the IMF is also currently actually recommending that there be more openness, more trade, and that trade be actually much more prevalent in the service area in particular, where there are much too high barriers. And we suggest some specific domestic policies to address those issues that you've mentioned. So anyway, Pierre and then Ulrich.
I should have started, Christine, by first thanking you for this initiative to have those meetings here, and the Indonesian authorities for organizing them so well. Why do I say that? Because it's far away from Europe, and so I had a very long flight. And during that flight, I read, or I finished to read, Mr. Woodward's book on Donald Trump. And it pictures a lot of discussions on trade between, I would say, the globalist approach, Gary Cohn, and the protectionist approach, Peter Navarro and others. And I think it clearly demonstrates that protectionism is not a solution, and that those who lose through protectionist measures are precisely those to whom you try to sell that protectionism is a solution. Workers of the automobile industry, blue-collar workers, poor people are those who were victims in the past of those measures. And there are those who will be victims again of measures taken of the same kind. And so I agree with Ernesto, we need to address the real issues. And I would just mention two of them. The first one is about trade. There are changes in trade. You mentioned some figures of the diminishment of trade to GDP. Yeah. It was 1.5 times higher than GDP growth, and now we've seen a slowdown.
It was even 2, as Roberto said. It's sort of,
Why? I think we need to take into account, and that is also something that needs to be taken into account by WTO, the new economy, the fact that we are more and more into a services economy, the fact that we are having a digital economy, and that the imports in that economy are different and maybe lesser, that there are movements between emerging economies. We need absolutely to address the issue of overcapacities in China. nobody can say that this is not a problem. This has to be dealt with. And so we need to change also our approach to trade and to adapt multilateralism to this new deal on economy. And certainly, this is a point on which we must reflect, and also we must reflect on the fact that there can be no good trade deal today which does not include environmental, health issues, culture issues, agriculture issue, and without a democratic control. There is certainly a will by the people there that needs to be heard. That's the first thing. And the second is that, as you said, Ernesto, the question of inequalities has to be addressed in our societies through our own domestic. And when I mean domestic, I speak about the EU.
Region.
I'm not only speaking about a country. I was finance minister in my country, just like you, before me. But we are French, but we know that the solution is at least European, if not worldwide. But we need to address the question of inequalities, and that's probably where we did not succeed during the crisis, and I think that's a point on which we must insist. But certainly, it cannot be through protectionism. It cannot be against trade. We need a better trade, not less trade. We need a reformed multilateralism, not the dismantlement of multilateralism, and we need a fight against inequalities which come from our own capacity and our own will.
Ulrich, you wanted to jump
just
on
picking
that.
up on your question, I think it is more important right now in history than ever before that we do not create a false dilemma between being on the one hand proponent of free trade and then also mindful that the gains from free trade are more evenly distributed. I think perhaps for a couple of decades we have taken it for granted, at least in the elite and among economists, I'm an economist myself, that as long as we abided to free trade, everything was in order. That has not been the case entirely over the last couple of decades. We have not seen these benefits from trade distributed evenly. Middle classes in some Western countries have not been experiencing an increase, while, of course, in developing countries, many have been lifted out of poverty. So we have not been mindful enough of the distributions from free trade. And I would say that there is perhaps two features that technological change and free trade have in common. And one is that they both are, of course, very, very strong engines of growth. That is my whole premise for being here, I guess, on this panel. But secondly, they both create very visible losers. It's very easy to identify the losers from trade and the losers from technology, whereas the gains are much more evenly distributed, even though they far outweigh the losses. So for us, in Denmark, if I may just offer one best practice, I did offer earlier one worst practice, dating back to the Vikings, so I think I'm allowed to one best practice. And I would say that our labor market, where we have both the labor unions and business collectively agreeing on the rules of the labor market, means that it's very easy to lay people off in Denmark, but then again there is a very strong social safety net. So in Denmark, whether you are in or out of job is not a matter of existence, and this actually allows the economy to keep a dynamism and keep exploiting new possibilities from the market without leaving anyone completely behind. That, along with social policies, educational policies, means that people that are laid off will, while they enjoy a good social safety net, will actually be able to bring their skills up to date to the modern economy. So that is, I think, one of the secrets, it's not a secret, but it's one of the keys behind the continued backing of the Danes towards free trade.
I can see very well an argument between the two of you, but I'm not going to go there. And you could also both agree, actually. So I'll leave it there. I just want to point out one thing. I believe that Denmark has just been singled out as the country that deals the best with the risk of inequality, and which is reputed by Oxfam, to name it, as really doing a fantastic job with those issues. And it proves the point that you can actually deal with those inequalities, you can raise your middle class, you can respond to those domestic issues, and yet be a very open economy that is very amenable to open trade with the rest of the world. Roberto, you have been, since you were appointed a Director General of the WTO, you've been a champion of reform. For many, many years, ministers of trade had tried, and I was one of them for a period, to conclude the Doha round to no avail. And you decided, your predecessor had something to do with it as well, but you decided that maybe it wasn't the best approach to try to do it all with everyone, where nothing was agreed until everything was agreed, and to actually identify and carve out from the Doha round areas that could be agreed upon. That was called plurilateralism. Not quite, actually. It's later on that you come to plurilateralism. Yeah. That's more like the carving out of smaller areas of where there can be agreement. But then you explored, whether it was information technology or procurement, the plurilateral approach. Can you explain to us how that has worked, whether you see an avenue for more agreement using those techniques and identifying areas where there can be agreement, or domain where players will get together and agree on something?
No, I think you touched on two very critical points. I think that the system was slow in responding to negotiations and agreements and new conditions on the ground. It's unequivocal. Everybody knows that. Since 2013, we began to do things a little bit differently to see what could be done. So the first thing we did was to introduce flexibility, and it's all about flexibility. Introduce flexibility in the substance of the agreement. That was the trade facilitation agreement. Right. So what does that mean? That countries would themselves, because there were many developing countries who said, I cannot do all these things that you're asking me to do. So he said, you know what? You're going to decide how quickly you can implement the things that you have to do, and you tell us how much time you need to implement those provisions that have been negotiated. So the country itself would decide, for this one I need 2 years, for that one I need 3 years, this one I can do immediately, and so on and so forth. And more than that, there were provisions where they would say, look, it's not a matter of time, I need technical assistance. I can't do that by myself. I need somebody to help me. So there was a lot of flexibility introduced in terms of the substance of the agreement, and that made it possible for all 164 to be on board. That doesn't always work. There are some situations when that doesn't always work. So in those situations, we tried, and some members in the WTO negotiated the information technology agreement. There were 20-some countries. It's a trade that covers more than $1 trillion of merchandise. And that worked, but it's just a few, and the results apply to everybody else. So it's on a most favored nation basis.
So it's agreed between the 23
and whatever they apply to each other
MFA.
Applies to everybody else.
Right.
So it's on most favored nation basis.
Yeah.
That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it applies only to the signatories. But that is trickier because it requires everybody else to agree to that in some situations. Now people are thinking about creative ways of doing plurilaterals that may be hybrids, that have parts of one, parts of the other. All of this effort is trying to ensure that the system can evolve and respond in a way that people can live with. There are very significant and different views that are contrasting with each other. So this is not yet a firm path and a smooth path. There will be a lot of attrition between members, but this is something that is being explored. And like you said, it holds potential to make the system more responsive.
In the second generation, the one that you said can be restricted to the signatories, does it require the unanimous agreement of all members, or can one member just step in the way and stop the mechanism? Can we think
the one that applies only to the signatories, there's controversy here. So we have an annex, Annex 4, where you list the agreements, and those agreements apply only to those signatories. That requires multilateral consensus. Yeah. Now, some members are saying, I require consensus or agreement on the part of the others if I am somehow reducing their rights, if I am discriminating against them. If I am not, if I am just undertaking additional commitments, I don't have to ask anybody's permission to undertake additional commitments.
Right.
That's a different conversation. And arguably, that wouldn't even have to go in Annex 4. That can be something that applies to the signatories, but because they wanted to go further. And in between these two, there are 100 different shades of gray. So I would say this is a conversation that still has some way to go among the WTO members.
Can any of you think of areas? We had free trade facilitation, we had information technology, we have procurement. Any other areas where you think that that sort of segmented agreement could also be beneficial? Maybe you?
Well, they already in Buenos Aires initiated the members themselves at least 4 areas. One was electronic commerce. Mm-hmm. The other was facilitation of investments, work to help small and medium enterprises, and empowerment of women. So those 4 areas are already being discussed, not necessarily negotiated, but discussed to see what can be done. But these are just 4. There can be more. If we read the headlines, papers around the world, I'm sure that you will identify a whole bunch of other areas where WTO members, big ones, are saying we need to work on this, 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 and that.
Okay. I remember my days as trade minister, and I always remember that, for instance, India or a few other emerging market economies would be in the way and say, no, not happy with that, don't want this, don't want that.
You mean Brazil? Not this one.
Well, there were a few emerging market economies that were taking the same position. I just remember India because we had difficult discussions with India.
Celso Amorim.
Eh?
Celso Amorim.
Oh, he was difficult too, yeah. But Kamal Nath was great too.
My hands are closed. I have no fingers to point at any.
Okay, all right. As a retired one, I
No
can.
finger pointing, but that's true. I mean, but that's the point today. That's still the point today. That to move things forward in the traditional way that we do things, you'll require everybody to be on board. Somebody may say, no, I don't want that. And that's the conversation today, because there are many members who are upset with this and that want to overcome this difficulty. And right now, there is no final outcome. I think they're still discussing.
Ulrich, and then I would want to come to you, Pierre, for some proposals.
No, I would just say that for Denmark as a small country and also for EU, we are champions of multilateralism, and we would always prefer to go through the WTO for trade agreements and liberalization of trade. However, it's also a fact that we haven't had a real proper successful round of negotiations since the Uruguay round, since the WTO was formed. That doesn't mean that a lot of useful stuff has not taken place in the WTO. You mentioned a lot of them, Roberto, and we should perhaps also talk about the dispute settlement mechanism, which provides clarity and rules for all of us. That is often understated. But after 25 years, if we are not able to produce multilateral agreements in the new areas that really matter, on e-commerce, on digital trade, but also trade in services, where we are in many ways where we were in trade in goods perhaps 50 years ago, we need to pursue plurilateral agreements. We need to pursue regional agreements, not as the best option, but as the second best option. And that has also increasingly become the European position over the last, I would say, half decade or full decade, Pierre.
Do you want to bounce from that?
Yes, and also on what Roberto said about flexibility. Because I'm here speaking on behalf of my colleague Cecilia Malmström, who couldn't come here, but she's the trade commissioner. And as you know well, trade is a competence which has been given, even under the control of the Council of Ministers, by member states to the EU Commission. And we are thinking about some reforms. And to think about reforms, we need to see where the problems are. And we believe that first, there are some issues that are not addressed by the WTO as they should. And I speak especially about digital economy, also think about trade and investment overcapacities. And this is a point that needs to be addressed. This is simply due to the fact that we are living with rules that were defined under the GATT period, and we are in a different period. Second point, We want this to be dealt with in order to establish a level playing field, which is not a level playing field downside, but upside. And that's why we need to reinforce the multilateral system. Third, there is a blockage institutionally, which is due to the fact that the organization functions by consensus, and that obviously some members tend to act on their own due to their own interest, and even some of them seem to want to belong to WTO and not to follow the rules, and which is a contradiction in terms, but you clearly see that some countries are moving that way. This is why when Roberto talked about flexibility, yes, there was this joint statement in Buenos Aires that we welcome, and we are planning to act in that direction, and our proposals move in that direction. But let's say it frankly, flexibility as well in substance and in the approaches to us should be as general as necessary. You have taken 4 examples. Those 4 examples are 4 examples which are totally relevant in our mind, but flexibility must be the driving principle of reforms of WTO in the future. And we are fully ready to examine all proposals that you and the organization might want to propose in that direction.
I can't propose anything.
No,
but,
examine.
But if I could, just to be fair, I mentioned all those areas, but it's also true that in some areas we have been working for a long time, like in agriculture. So right now, some people are saying we need to talk about industrial subsidies, but it's also, I would say, a stretch to say now we talk about industrial subsidies and we don't talk about agricultural subsidies, because developing countries have been fighting for that for a long time. So I think we have to find some way forward, and I agree with you entirely. I think flexibility is the key. We have to see how that goes, but we have also, everybody has to contribute somehow to this conversation.
Okay. Roberto, I really don't want to put you on the spot on that one, and I thank you, Pierre, for representing Cecilia, who could not make it. Could you tell us just a little bit about those proposals that Europe has made just recently, as did Canada for that matter, to actually make some positive, concrete proposals to improve the WTO with flexibility in mind?
No, basically, it's about what I said before. I would just add one thing. It's about a fresh approach to the issue of special and differential treatment for developing countries. We think that rather than exclusion of the rules, we should focus on transitional periods, on commitments contingent, on capacity building, and even on linking the stringency of disciplines with the level of development of the WTO members which are concerned. And at the same time, we have to find the right balance and give flexibilities to those WTO members who really need them to pursue their development objective. That is a very specific area on which we have made concrete proposals. But again, if I would just have 2 messages, the first one is, let's not kill the baby. Multilateralism is the essence. Reform of the multilateral institutions are key. We must strengthen WTO. We must adapt it to the economy of today, but we must certainly not damage the system or enter into any kind of trade wars. It's time for de-escalation. And the second message, and all our proposals are based on it, is flexibility, 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 flexibility. Since the organization cannot work today due to geopolitical factors that we all know on the basis of consensus, let's have as much flexibility as possible in all areas that are relevant. We mentioned 4. Again, the joint statement is certainly a basis for us, but we want flexibility as well on substance and on approaches and also on decision-making process. These are the basis of our proposal.
So in particular, the rule of unanimity should be revisited. The path towards development should
But it's not
be
written.
accommodated.
I mean, this is a big confusion.
Can I just finish?
It's
Ernesto,
not
just for a second. Just for a second, and I'll give you the floor in a second.
Yeah, it's not
Okay.
written.
I'll give you the floor in a microsecond, okay? So, and the rest is flexibility, flexibility, flexibility.
Absolutely.
And should that reform process include all players, or should it be worked out amongst regions and then expanded, opened up? How do you foresee that?
I mean, when you want to reform an institution, it's good for the EU too. The first thing is you must try to bring everybody on board. And then if you cannot, those who are willing to go further can build coalition of willingness. That's the way I think we should proceed. But we should not start by dividing the process and by having purely regional or interregional approaches.
Ernesto, all yours.
Well, first, a general consideration. And I don't want to diminish the importance of this discussion, because I think it's extremely important to look at the details on how to move forward in reforming some procedures and approaches at the WTO so that, issues get solved. However, there's a much bigger issue, which is an existential issue for the WTO, that I think we should discuss very explicitly. There is a country which was really, in a way, the architect of the multilateral trading system in more than one respects, that has at least semi-explicitly expressed openly its animosity against the WTO. And it's expressing that animosity on very practical terms. On the one hand, it has been blocking the appointment of the members of the appellate body. I think Director General will tell us at this pace when the appellate body will stop working for having enough judges. And the US is blocking the appointment of those. And when that happens, I think one of the fundamental aspects of the WTO will become useless. And I think that's an existential problem for the WTO. So that's number one. Number two, we have started a trade war of incredible proportions. The US have been imposing arbitrarily tariffs on China without a due process which could be provided by the WTO. If there are complaints against China, those should be investigated and brought as cases before the WTO, and yet the United States, using spurious arguments, has started this trade war, not only against China, but against other traditional trade partners of the United States, arguing that for national security reasons, the European Union, tariffs on aluminum and steel, Canada, aluminum and steel, Mexico, and this is totally unwarranted by the law. And of course, we know that it will take a few years, if ever, before the WTO decides that this is illegal. So I think it is very nice to discuss all these steps that can be taken, either going by the figure of clubs, which is basically the plurilaterals, or do we insist on the single undertaking? There is no lack of ideas. I think the IMF itself has produced a very nice catalog. There are a number of papers out there. There's a group of economists that we have been working. Our chair is Bernard Hockman, where we have a number of ideas how to go about it. But frankly, the discussion looks frivolous in view of what is already in front of us. And the question is whether the WTO has the capacity to react to this behavior by the United States.
Ernesto, you might be very right, but in the meantime, as you say, it takes a few years for different things to happen. And in the meantime, we need to continue operating according to a particular framework, because we can shout as much as we want from the top of the roof. It's not going to change particular issues. So in the meantime, we need to look at our system and see how we can improve it, how we can fix it rather than break it. And that's the point about those frivolous discussions that we're having. And I would contend that they're not that frivolous, actually.
I would go a bit further and say that while I entirely agree with things that you said, Ernesto, but part of this exercise is to see whether through this, what people are calling now a WTO reform, you can address changes or you can make changes that will reduce those tensions.
Absolutely.
And that would approximate the parties and hopefully bring to a conversation that would get this trade war reversed somehow. So that's one of the purposes, is to make sure that through this dialogue, through this effort, we can try to reverse and diminish the tensions that you see out there now. It's not
But
just
how long
academic.
will it take before the global economy is severely damaged with these tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on China? I mean, do we really have a horizon to fix the WTO, or is this going to be forcing the IMF to change, as you have already done, which I think is very reasonable, your World Economic Outlook? I don't know in 6 months what you will have to say, Christine, given what's going on trade. I think it will be much worse than today. Because this is crazy.
You know what? The good news actually is that our forecast at 3.7 did not take into account the agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada. So we probably had a worst case scenario than what is going to unfold, assuming this USMCA is actually ratified. So we maybe have a little bit of margin there. Pierre?
I think we must and cannot accept the idea that we are living in a trade war. We have some problems, huge problems, caused by the unilateral attitude of one partner, which is totally legitimate. But then we must try, as you said, to de-escalate and also to find solutions. If I take the example of the European Union, when we were attacked and proposed to create tariffs on aluminum and steel, we first were shocked, because how can the United States of America consider that the Europeans are in a war, their enemies, when we were always allies? Precisely. That makes no sense. And our first answer was to say, okay, if they want to do that, then we will react, and we prepared measures. Then we will go to WTO, because we respect the multilateral framework. And then we make proposals. And finally, we enter into a discussion which is limited, precise, with the United States, not excluding responding. I think this is the correct answer. As you said, to de-escalate is try to be firm, but at the same time to be available for dialogue. It's about fixing the system, and we need to do that. And then there are also issues that need to be addressed collectively, and certainly China overcapacities are an issue. Nobody cannot deny that, but not through unilateral measures, but also through discussions that are multilateral. We spoke about WTO, but there are other instances to which we belong. I think about G20. We will meet tomorrow and we will have the discussion. I think about G7. I think also about bilateral talks. So I think that we need to be at the same time totally firm versus unilateral action, totally in defense of the multilateral system, clearly in the will to fix it and to have it work better, but also, when we have used all these terms, trying to find a dialogue, because we cannot accept war. War is meaningless. War is a mistake, and this is why de-escalation, as you said, Christine, certainly must be our common attitude. De-escalation does not mean weakness.
No.
It means trying to find solutions and trying to impose dialogue even to those who create that situation.
Never leave the table. Yeah. Ulrich?
Thank you. I've been quiet because I was consulting both hats I could possibly wear in this discussion, and none of them wanted to intervene, really. But what I think should be said here as well is that I was in Washington last week, and you can also find very strong voices within the U.S. administration that we should not abandon multilateralism, but that we need to reform. And I think we should perhaps do all we can to engage in constructive dialogue with the voices in the U.S. administration who really still believe in multilateralism, but want to perhaps change because the rules of the games have changed. And let's be fair, the power structures in this world and the market mechanisms in this world, they have changed since we created the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT and the WTO. So without disregarding all the challenges that have been mentioned here, because they're certainly there, and multilateralism is under pressure, and we fear that the international order is crumbling before our eyes as Danes, we should be constructive, we should engage, we should try to reform the multilateral system so it can still accommodate the U.S. economy, because it's not worth a whole lot if we don't have the Americans aboard. And I think really we still need American leadership. I hope that the EU can step in to a certain degree, but to think of reforms of the multilateral framework without the US is very difficult.
Now, I just want to turn to the organizers. I was told we had 75 minutes. Is that the case? So I still have, okay, that's brilliant. Because I want to give the floor to you. But before I do that, I want you, Roberto, to tell us a little bit where the dispute mechanism stands and whether the panel solving mechanism is still working, is still supported and favored by all members, and where are we on that one?
Well, it's still working, but it's already being delayed. So
right.
There are some significant delays that will be coming up. The situation we have today is normally you have 7 appellate body members, and now we have 3. And that is the minimum number we need to hear an appeal and decide. Right. So by the end of next year, another one may be leaving, will be leaving, and if things continue the way they are, he will not be replaced. So that leaves 2. At that point in time, the appellate body cannot hear appeals any longer. So what that means is that you have a panel, and usually the losing party is the one that appeals, then the losing party will appeal. The appellate body will not be in a position to hear the appeal, and then the report will not be adopted. So it essentially paralyzes. But at this point in time, members in the WTO are already discussing alternatives. I'm not in a position to disclose what those alternatives are.
Fair enough.
They're told to me in confidence, but they are thinking about alternatives in case we reach that situation. But it's a fundamental blow, I think, to the organization if we let that happen.
Because it was a fundamental force of the organization.
Absolutely, that's the point. I mean, some members would say, what's the point of negotiating rules if I have no means of enforcement?
Sure.
There's nobody to say whether somebody's violating the rules or not. So what's the point of doing this to begin with? But there are many steps to get there, and we're working with them. But at this point in time, I have to say I don't have, I cannot tell members that I see a light at the end of the tunnel. I just don't.
Do you see a little glimpse of a light?
Not yet. It's
not
pretty
yet.
Dark.
No dancing on this stage.
But people are thinking. So it's not that, WTO members are crossing their arms and waiting to see what happens. Yeah. No, they are actively thinking about options. They're looking at different scenarios, even the worst case scenario, which is the one that I just described.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Anyone who has a burning question, please be recognized. So I see a hand back there, and I know there are 2 microphones in the room. So second row here to my right. Microphone, please, right here. Gentlemen, can you stand up and are you a gentleman? Yes, you're wearing a hat. I could only see your hand. So bring the microphone here, second row. Thank you so much. Come on, come on, come on. Thank you. Introduce yourself, please, and ask your question.
Helmer Preuss, Alliance News. My question is about Africa. I'm based in South Africa, and we haven't had any discussion about the continent that is actually being proactive in terms of expanding. And I want to ask, in terms of IMF, World Bank, WTO, what's the progress in terms of one-stop border posts? There has been a lot of progress since Shirunda was first started way back in 2007. And how are you addressing informal cross-border trade? Because the stats aren't there. Do you have estimates? Are you building capacity amongst the member states in Africa?
By the way, we did not specifically discuss Africa, but in the proposals that Pierre described on behalf of the EU, I understand that there were some specific provisions for those developing countries, and clearly there is quite a number of them, including in the African continent. Of course, not South Africa itself.
Well, in the WTO itself, I think it's fair to say that Africa has been very prominent in particularly advocating for African integration, which I think is a very, very worthy cause, and I think the WTO should support it as much as possible. In fact, one of our recent agreements, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, is going to be fundamental, because if you want to have African integration, you need to have border procedures which allow Africa to talk to each other and to integrate even more. I think this is very much at the table in the WTO. Like I said, we are there to be as supportive as possible. There are many partners that are helping African countries with infrastructure, border procedures that will help the process of integration. Hopefully, it will be an open integration. That's my particular hope, is that Africa will be integrating to compete with the world, to integrate in the world, not close itself in a fortress Africa, because I think that will be the wrong way to go. But that's my view. I may be wrong. And that may not be the choice.
You're describing here the African Regional Trade Agreement that was just entered into.
Recently.
Well, that's part of a bigger continental integration. Yeah.
Well, South Africa has just recently joined, if I remember, and the big one
That's one step towards
Nigeria. Yeah. Anyone else? Please. Wait, the microphone is not working for you. Somebody else is. Yeah. There you are.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Cindy. I'm from Indonesia. It's Coalitions. There is an interesting issue, or because you mentioned about the trade flexibilities in the WTO that the developing country can use. But the other thing that we know that currently there is a free trade agreement, and we know that there is also a 3+. So my concern is about that when there is a 3+ proposals, there is always an impact to the access to the medicines, especially as life-saving medicines. And I want to know what is the WTO position about this, and how to ensure that the use of trade flexibilities can really use in this global trade.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
With a particular focus on developing countries and emerging markets. So TRIPS?
Well, first of all, we had the TRIPS amendment ratified. So that means that in the particular situation of countries who, for example, issue a compulsory license but do not have the ability to produce the medicine themselves, they can outsource that from other countries without infringing intellectual property rights. TRIPS is a very complex agreement. I dealt with it quite a bit. Right now, there are, if we are all reading the press, some countries are asking for higher levels of enforcement because there is not enough respect of the intellectual property rights in some countries. That's the argument out there. At this point in time, I have to tell you, first of all, it's not the WTO that has a view, and the WTO doesn't have a view about anything. It is members who have a view about things. We facilitate the conversation, but we don't propose, we don't enforce, we don't go like a referee in a soccer match, blowing the whistle and making the match stop. We don't do that. Only if they ask us. Otherwise, we don't do that. But at this point in time, the TRIPS conversations, negotiations are very low-key. They are not at this point in time at the top of the agenda. It may come under the European paper that I saw about WTO reform. There is a very significant portion about reinforcement of intellectual property rights, but that's one proposal. There will be other things on the table. We have to see how that conversation evolves. At this point in time, it's way too early. I don't think that that has even been discussed with other WTO members. So it's the view of a few delegations. We have to see how that conversation will evolve. It's very early still.
Okay, I think I have time for one more question. So here, one of the two there on the right. Yes? Yes? You're the lucky one.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Rico. I'm a student. I'd like to ask, you are talking about the flexibility, and flexibility. I think I just want to more specify what kind of flexibility can be implemented to the developing countries, just like Indonesia, maybe the low tax, and the second question is regarding all the decisions must be followed by maybe international ratifications. Can the WTO can more simplify that bureaucracy to easy make developing countries together easy access to that? Thank you.
WTO definition of flexible bureaucracy.
You don't have views.
You know,
Yeah.
that's okay. If I understood correctly, you were asking about flexibility for accessions as well, right? Is that right?
I think it's more general.
Yeah.
Speaking about flexibility of policies.
Okay. We were talking about flexibilities in terms of negotiations, how to make progress in the negotiations, and the way to do that was to be flexible in the way we do things, either with the substance of the agreement or with the way that you negotiate, whether you have all WTO members or some of the WTO members, and then you would have flexible geometries or flexible substances to make progress. You are talking about flexibility to countries to implement provisions and developing countries in particular.
Yeah.
Every time we negotiate, there are flexibilities that are there for developing countries. Right now, there is one very contentious issue, which is some countries are saying that some developing countries are not really developing countries. They have already developed. And therefore, they should not be entitled to the same degree of flexibility that others do have. So this conversation is beginning to pick pace. It is, as you can imagine, it's very, very contentious, very, very polemic. And I think we have to be very creative here, because if we begin a conversation trying to reclassify each WTO member in one category or another, we're never going to have an agreement. So I think we have to find, again, creative and flexible ways of allowing those who can contribute more to contribute more, and those who are not in a position to contribute so much to have more flexibility in doing that. That's exactly what I was describing that we achieved with the trade facilitation agreement. So in that agreement, for example, the big emerging economies, they didn't require any, they unilaterally, spontaneously said, I don't need more time to implement. I will implement immediately. And that is what allowed the agreement to take place, because otherwise, if they hadn't done that, many developed countries would have said, then it's a no deal for me. If you're not on board from the beginning, it's a no deal for me. But other countries who needed time because of their development level to implement the provisions, they said, I need more time, and they were granted that time. So again, I think this is a conversation that deserves flexibility.
But I would say...
I think I'm going to give 30 seconds to each of you. So you start, Ernesto.
Yeah, on this point, because I frequently hear this conversation that the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank limit countries' flexibility to do things. And I can give you a very specific example about Indonesia, in which evidently the IMF or the WTO has nothing to do with something that must be done in Indonesia, which is very important for the development and the health of Indonesia. And that has to do with tobacco consumption, right? Indonesia is not part of the WHO agreement to campaign and to tax tobacco. And it is not part because there are both national and international companies that have had an unduly influence on government policies, right? And I would say that has nothing to do with the multilateral organizations. In fact, the WHO is very frustrated that Indonesia has not subscribed to that international understanding. And yet you have a very serious health problem. But this is a matter of domestic policy. It is up to Indonesians to tell their government, we have to change this because this is good for our health. That's domestic policy. It has nothing to do with international organizations.
Ulrich, 30 seconds.
Thank you. My final words would be that we live now in times of really unprecedented unpredictability, at least in my lifetime. And we're playing with fire when we're talking about reforming our institutions. We should really value our institutions. We should cherish them. We should also reform them to make them useful to all the players. But that would be my message. And the title of this day has been How Global Trade Can Promote Growth for All. And I would say that my country, or the example, the best practice from Denmark, is that not only can global trade promote growth for all, it has promoted and it continues to promote growth for all citizens in Denmark.
Thank you very much. Roberto? Oh, you've spoken already enough?
I spoke a lot, but I think, first of all, first and last of all, let's have an informed conversation. Blaming trade, blaming the immigrant is easy for the politician because that is the timing of the elections. This is something they can work with in 3 or 4 years. Introducing trade barriers or migration policies, that's quick to do. Fixing the problems, really, those take time. And you're not going to tell the voter that you're going to deliver something in 5, 10, or 15 years because that's what it will require. It will require more education. It will require the skill of the workforce. It will require a bunch of fundamental policies that will take time to be in place. But it is up to the civil society to ask for those reforms and to fight for those reforms because they are the ones that are going to fix it. It's not blocking trade and blocking other easy-to-do things that is going to solve and fix the situation we're in.
Pierre?
The debate on trade, obviously, is now very political, and it's linked to the issue of populism, and I would say the same for migration. The problem is that those difficulties are raised by the legacies of the crisis. And I would say the same for multilateralism and for Europe. In Europe, some say that Europe is the problem. I say that Europe is a solution. Some say that multilateralism is a problem. Multilateralism is a solution. But to convince from that, we need to have a better Europe and a better multilateralism. So I think that we must be offensive and we must reform those systems. We must do that with a lot of strength. Because if we don't, then the populists will lead the war and they risk to win it. So we must really upgrade our ambitions on as well regional integration, and that's good for Africa, that's good for EU, and also on multilateralism as such. So that's, I think, the purpose of this debate.
And to paraphrase Ernesto, recognize the problems for what they are and not attribute them to trade, and deal with the problems with the right instruments both at home and internationally. Big round of applause for this extraordinary panel.
Well done.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while the delegations departs the auditorium. Thank you.